Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today at your Pushback channel. While you're with us, please take a moment to subscribe below, and to receive notifications, please click on the bell symbol. This essay considers the issues around and attempts to explain and define communist economics and why communism failed. For those who may be new to the subject, communism is the more militant and revolutionary form of socialism. Both terms are used in this essay. Karl Marx and Marxism is used as the bedrock or the underwriting ideology behind both communism and socialism, and this also will be mentioned. Today it seems communism and socialism are making a comeback in the consciousness of many on the cultural Marxist political left. Nor is this confined to being a silly post-pubescent thing for female college students chanting femi-Marxist slogans on campus. At UCLA Berkeley in California, the works of Bolshevik Vladimir Lenin have been given star billing in a series of talks. Consider the surprising success of presidential hopeful Senator Bernie Sanders in the United States and the leftist Labour Prime Ministerial candidate Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. Socialism is clearly on the move. Now, none of the street march stooges that march for socialism or socialism-related issues seem to know anything about its origins or the history of socialism or socialist economics or socialist structure. So perhaps the most interesting aspect of studying communist economics is not that it failed whenever it was tried, but rather how close it came to succeeding, which adds an element of interest to the whole subject, I think. Yet few across the political spectrum understand what the communist system was or how it functioned economically, and importantly the structural deficiencies that led to its failure. For those wanting to come to grips with the wider topic of communist or Soviet economics, it may be worth reading the multiple works of Alexander Alec Nove, N-O-V-E, and I will attempt to provide an overview here in under 25 minutes or so. Please remember you can acquire this or any 14 of our essays in printed format, softcover book format. This is a lot to take in, so we appreciate a hard copy on hand will assist you with your further examining of this topic, and is relevant today as it ever was in understanding our present or current times. The Soviet states practiced a form of state-level capitalism rather than individual capitalism. Production surpluses in food, raw materials and finished goods were always a goal of the state and the central planners, but all surpluses were to be communally produced and owned, with reinvestment in production a greater priority than personal consumption or production of consumer goods. Private ownership other than personal effects was not permitted, thus all forms of land, buildings and means of production was owned by the state. The houses of the well-off, or in the pre-revolutionary times the well-off, were seized by the state with considerable, if not perverse delight, turned into schools or propaganda museums. To be sure, some private property, such as private housing in remote areas and some small agricultural plots, did remain in private hands, but this could be revoked at the whim of a party official, so the state was not committed to the protection of private property in any capitalist sense of the term. Work practices were in many ways the same as those in capitalist societies. Workers could still work overtime, they were eligible for productivity pay bonuses, and had the option of, in many cases, piecework, that is, being paid per unit of production, so that the fitter and harder working folks could boost their pay accordingly. The Soviet system offered many and numerous incentives and benefits to workers, such as trips to state-owned vacation resorts, as well as pay bonuses for exceptional hard work. Benefits could make up 20 to 25% of a total income package. Propaganda poster workers were awarded medals, which included the heavily propagandized Hero of the Soviet Union medal. Education, health, housing, transport, banking and aged care were nationalised and supplied by the state to the citizenry with varying degrees of effectiveness. A tiny proportion of the economy, about 4% of all agricultural land, remained in semi-private hands, which included specialist vegetable growing and other limited non-broadacre type crop production, such as herbs, including garlic, parsley, dill and tarragon. Some private land plots also produced eggs and sold their surplus to the local community. For small landholders, corruption and standover tactics by Communist Party heavies, who insisted on privileged access to all produce from these small plots, was a constant problem, as was the threat by party officials to withdraw licences, permissions or levy fines. Nearly all resources to facilitate production were centrally planned and allocated in advance, as were the output of all production, be it primary or secondary products, including nearly all food and all finished goods. The ideological purpose of a centrally planned economy is that communists believe at least, it to be theoretically more efficient as it removes profiteering, hoarding and overaccumulation in any one place of the economy or section of the economy, or overaccumulation in the hands of, say, any one individual. Such an assertion of alleged non-waste is superficially accurate, but cannot withstand more in-depth scrutiny, such as how communism wastes on the backhand by over-allocation in unproductive usage and some substandard quality products. Removing a perceived bad such as profiteering does not automatically mean it will be replaced with a good, which was a socialist thinking that displayed a type of naivety that bedeviled all communist organising and planning, believing that if we take the bad things away, that is private profit, then only good things will be left behind. It's an absurdly childish attitude insofar as the capacity to perceive the multiple interactive forces of the market and of production and the nuance of that are all missing. While central planning can work successfully where predictability of outcome is very high through minimum variables or where conditions are tightly controlled, in situations of many interacting variables, outcomes are usually hampered by the rigidity of the central planning. That is, central planning is less likely to be beneficial and successful where predictability of outcome is low, or where on-the-spot reactions and responses to variable sets of circumstances on the ground are critical to eventual success. Now, the communists used, and most planners do, two forms of planning. One is to assume a production target, which are usually very optimistic in the communist sense. They usually add on a good 30% to try and get people to work harder to chase the target. So one is to assume a production target, then to allocate resources consistent with that target. So, say for example, one tractor is needed for every 100 bushels of wheat, say. Therefore, if a farm has a target of 500 bushels, it's one tractor per 100 bushels, so 500 bushels target, then that requires 5 tractors, which are duly allocated in the central plan, along with fuel and rail transport to move the tractors from the factory to the farm and so on. The flow-on effects through the Soviet economy of, say, an increase in agricultural quotas could be dramatic, as it may involve or require a tripling of, say, tractor production, and then there's a whole range of downstream planning, such as extra allocations of steel to make the tractors, rubber for the tyres, and so on and so forth. The second method of planning is to allocate a set amount of resources, the inputs, a set amount of resources, and then based on those resources extrapolate or assume a notional production quota minimum or a minimum to maximum range. Now, to assume as a production target and allocate required resources to meet that target requires an outcome of high predictability with few critical variables. So if we, again, just going back there, if we put a high, very ambitious target of production and then allocate resources to that, that requires some high predictability if you're going to play that one. As the ratio of variables increases, so as predictability declines, as the ratio of variables increases, the most prudent form of planning is to allocate resources based on a minimum expectation of outcome. And if production exceeds, or those opportunities exceeds those minimum expectations of outcome production, the opportunity there to follow up quickly with more resources to try and make the most of the situation. A mistake the Soviets made again and again was to place rigid quotas on situations of high variability, such as those being subject to extreme weather conditions, of course resulting in many failures. Similarly, to avoid the flexible quick response planning as being wasteful and morally weak. Soviet planners in the planning hothouses of downtown Moscow constantly claimed and asserted that force of will combined with unflinching socialist ideology were the essential, if not the only components of planning success, with concern over practical details being an example of decadence and weakness. That is not to say that output of tons of coal mined or pig iron manufactured or steel produced did not increase dramatically during the 5-year plans. They did, but from a very low base, a very low starting point, and only after vast and brutally applied resources had been put into it. Communist economics socialises loss and gain across the entire economy, usually by restricting non-productive consumption as the correcting valve or safety valve of first resort. So it's more factories being produced but fewer candy bars and scarcity of private motor vehicles or consumer goods generally. That's where the safety valve comes in. They just cut back on that to try and stay with the main production economy, such as coal mining or tractor production and so on. Private and factory level profit and loss are not recognised. So to finance, particularly again in these two 5-year plans, 1928 to 1938. So to finance the initial establishment of all these newly erected state-owned factories, each factory or mine can acquire credits from the central bank, which in effect become barter swap system brokered by the state-owned bank to be traded with other suppliers and other customers. This bartering is all woven into the central planning architecture. So the newly erected factory uses these credits to buy industrial manufacturing machinery from another factory, or buy raw materials from the mines, for example. The industrial machinery factory in turn acquires its steel and coal from the foundries and mines, and all the buying and selling of these capital goods or capital inputs is handled through the barter bank credit system. Over time, the factory can start producing the equipment machinery of its own and then supply those to the mines or other factories, and in essence pay back those bank credits by using that barter and swap system. A much more sophisticated version of this was used actually by the Nazis in the mid-1930s, particularly where they were looking at armaments production and so on. In one sense, this form of wide net socialising of the economic system can work in unique cases of intense, time-compressed, if not frantic industrialisation, starting from a low or early stage start to more intermediate economic development. It is much more difficult to do this sort of thing and difficult to imagine an advanced or tertiary economy utilising such a system other than perhaps large, badly run Western banks. As Soviet industrialisation was swift, again, particularly during those first 2 5-year plans, factories could go from drawing board to production within months, so bank credits could be repaid in a remarkably short time. And within a few years, some factories had repaid all their credits and had achieved what would be called a technical profit, whereupon they would sometimes move to a more money-based structure rather than using those barter and credits. Similarly, this densely packed industrial activity contains an efficiency within its own momentum. No matter how clumsily or haphazard resources are allocated, everything is used. So everything is used. There's no wastage in that sense. Thus, there is total employment of all available resources. So at the point of first pass usage, all resources are employed, no waste. It's maximum utilisation. Therefore, there is technically zero waste. Shortages in inputs created an efficiency as a byproduct of the very scarcity of the resources being used. Moreover, as suppliers and customers were mostly preordained by the central planning, factories did not need to allocate funds to salespeople and marketing people or purchasing departments or designing glossy packaging or anything like that. Suppliers and customers were all pre-planned, and these savings or ostensible savings were seen as efficiencies by the socialist planners. At the same time as these bank credits for swap, barter, interchange were clearly facilitating many transactions to take place that otherwise would not have, they still disengaged all the participants in the process from any notion of prudence, quality or efficiency. Now, that wasn't such a big deal where resources were scarce and there was all that frantic industrialising, but it would later become a factor when the scarcity brought about by the breakneck industrialisation ended, particularly in that early 1970s period. In the stampede to meet production quotas, factories would send substandard, badly made products out the door without a second's thought. Meeting that quota was the issue. Shoddy work that would have been picked up and weeded out by factories run on the profit motive in the West were routinely put into circulation in Russia. So there's a lot of substandard equipment out there. Items of production were not bought, chosen or selected on any form of merit, but allocated, as were all the attendant services such as shipping, storage and transport. It was all allocated through the central plan. Now, given this level of planning and all the tightly packed-in details, it's not hard to see how even a slight change to a plan could involve an immense amount of work, as all the implications of just one detail or one change need to be tracked back through a mountain of planning across many different government departments and ministries. Most of the time, it was all deemed as just too hard to make a change, and any problem was kicked down the road into next year's plan. And this happened a lot, often resulting in overcorrections in the following year of planning. At the factory level, factory managers often clandestinely attempted to create their own provisions to prepare for unexpected shortages. And so they did things like they overordered goods or items and overhired people whenever they could, just in case, just as a standby. Now, the effect of this was in response to over-tight planning. So the end result effect was to move the waste and inefficiency of bad planning or over-tight planning that was wound too tightly, to move the waste and efficiency of that problem of bad planning and move it just around to other parts of the economy rather than solve it completely at any given level. So the efficiency they were putting into the plans was actually dissipated and wasted because the plans didn't really work, and then the factories at the lower level down the economy, they just did workarounds and made their own plans around it, and so they created the efficiency that the plans would, when they were inefficient in themselves, were trying to get rid of. The very notion of having spare capacity on standby to respond to system or planning failures was itself seen as the very type of waste that central planning was meant to eradicate. So provision for the unexpected was not made at the planning level. It's much easier to make resource allocation spreadsheeted in a downtown city office look efficient and pretty on paper than it is to translate such planning and such an ideal picture into practical reality on the ground. Central planning and all ensuing allocations needed to use averages or previous year's data upon which to base projections of raw materials and allocations of raw materials and labour, which factory is going to make which goods, which production time slots for which components, and final product assembly and so on. Now, this is quite intricate and it had its challenges. For example, it's very difficult to know what the level of rainfall will be 12 months from today. So if it is particularly rainy season, there won't be enough raincoats in the retail stores if it's raining a lot. If on the other hand it's an unusually dry season, then the unbought raincoats will sit unused in storerooms, and resources that we used to make them will sit idle within that planning cycle. Local conditions that may be unique to a particular geographic region are also difficult to plan for by factoring in just averages. In the case of farming, many planning mistakes were made that resulted in great hardship and shortages of staples such as bread. Similarly, local soil and weather conditions at farm level were also subject to central planning rather than farmers on the spot. And the central planners treated all farms as if they were factories and could produce food on push-button demand, which of course they never could. And it's a very classic sort of bureaucratic planning response to things. If you wish for it hard enough and demand for it hard enough, send enough stern memos, then you can make it happen. But of course it doesn't work that way with things like farming and many other things. Farms that should have been growing turnips and carrots were allocated quotas to grow grains or cereals. Farms that should have been optimally growing cabbages or potatoes were allocated beets, and on it went. The result was things like over-farmed soils that were depleted, and then they were over-fertilised the next year, which in turn fouled the water supply, which then there was another fallow year waiting for the water supply to be cleaned up. Delicate soils allocated to cereal crops were turned into dust bowls by over-farming. Other than a small number of private farming plots, the Soviet agricultural system was divided into two tiers. First was to bring together into one managed group a series of smaller farms growing a wide variety of crops where all could share a common pool of equipment such as the tractors. Central planning was particularly disruptive to these farms, and failure to meet unrealistic production quotas would often result in socially conscious commissars from the city being sent to micromanage farm affairs, which inevitably made things even worse. The larger farms, which were better supplied with equipment and passably efficient in many respects, tended to specialise in broadacre cereal crops, and they did okay, or most of the time at least. Central planning, it seems, can never decide if it's producing or rationing. Similarly, without consumer choice and paying for quality, both vital market signals, workers and producers and factories and so on will be paid based on centrally planned allocation. So whether the work and materials are top quality or the poorest quality, all work is paid the same and prices are fixed, creating obvious perverse incentives. Non-essential consumer goods received the lowest priority in the Soviet production hierarchy, so even if workers worked hard to achieve maximum pay bonuses, there was so little to buy that it was hardly worth the effort. Similarly, desirable goods such as motor vehicles or TVs were sold from a waiting list and were hard to find in any shops other than display units. The shortage not only of consumer goods but frequently basics of day-to-day living such as bread created a thriving black market, thus pushing up the cost of living and creating widespread disenchantment. As no economic private incentives existed in the economy, the basis for benefits was built around a crony or patronage system for senior party officials. So those displaying adequate communist ideological ardour and those who may bring international public glory to the Soviet states, such as the Olympic athletes, were the ones who benefited. These benefits to the well-connected included access to special shops with Western consumer goods, Western movie screenings, well-stocked food shops, international travel, exotic resort vacations and exotic cruise ships to other communist countries and so on. The class elitism communism was meant to eradicate and sweep away was simply replaced with Communist Party crony elitism, which ironically was about equal in numbers to the privileged Russian aristocracy the revolution of 1917 had swept away. So much carnage and revolution and killing and ideological change only to find that cronyism and privilege had stayed exactly the same. As mentioned earlier, part of the central planning efficiency model was that all citizens work and consume. Thus, full employment was always a requirement of the system, which is theoretically very efficient at a state or macro level if all productive efforts are also efficient. But this was not so in the communist system, as to achieve full employment, jobs were just invented and college degrees were just handed out as qualification. Indeed, if communism was good at anything, it was its success at manufacturing or inventing unnecessary, do-nothing jobs. And this is particularly the case after 1970. Between 40 to 45% of all jobs were simply created or invented rather than needed. And these jobs were kept alive by inefficient, artificially labour-intensive work practices. Women were allowed dispensations with time off with pay for childbirth and caring for young children, and extensive creche facilities were also available. Similarly, women were permitted time off with pay to care for elderly relatives or to pursue additional studies. Education in the Soviet system was heavily dosed with ideology. Rural peasants were given degrees or permitted to study for 1 year and then given a degree that others had to study for 4 years, just so that rural minorities, the government could claim, were receiving an equal number of degrees to, say, the urban Russians. Similarly, the Soviet government resorted to magic wand initiatives to solve alleged skill shortages. A shortage of engineers would be declared, and then the government would reclassify various occupations by decree, such as shoe repairers as engineers, thus solving by decree what would have taken 5 to 10 years or longer to solve through more natural methods. The cronyism of party hacks and unrealistic and dysfunctional central planning also created a perverse form of passivity among the workforce and citizenry. Nobody ended up caring after the 70s and into the 80s. People merely existed and they lived and they died and drank vodka. While workers could go to prison for turning up late for work, lower level incompetence or go slow minimum work that when aggregated across an entire economy could be potentially devastating was rarely noticed and rarely carried any penalty for the workers. Did the communist economies create social equality such as, say, gender equality? Window dressing aside, women were disproportionately given the created or invented jobs and only gained real jobs if men were not available to fill them. And same as with all over the world, occupations such as nursing and hairdressing were the first choice of communist women as they are Western women. Even after 70 years of communism, where the majority of the population had experienced nothing else but quota-driven equality, upon the collapse of communism it was remarkable to any observer how quickly Russian women became sex objects and second-class citizens. The use of very photogenic front women aside, the Russian government has had very few women in senior posts, somewhere between 3 and 5%. The Soviet economy, and indeed all socialist communist economies, failed for more or less the same reasons. Even the East German state, that was arguably the most successful attempt at a communist system yet, it still failed, staggering under the weight of its own inefficiency. When in the 1990s East Germany integrated with West Germany, the capitalist West Germany, it was assessed East German communist overemployment had been in the region of 27%. That is, they had 27% more jobs than they actually needed. And that was the most efficient communist state that ever existed up to that time. So just summarising why communist economies fail. So probably the biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues, is coercion. The communist state relies heavily on coercing and re-educating and this mind, this thought police, and threatening the citizenry into compliance. By necessity, this involves taking away the legal rights of the citizenry, including arbitrary seizure, arbitrary arrest and detention, and ideological courts and vague ideological laws and statutes where transgression is arbitrarily decided by even lower level officials. Also, the number of secret police. There are millions of secret police in the Soviet Union. And when you consider the amount of secret police in the Soviet Union was something like 20 to 30 times more than the Nazis needed, then it gives you an idea of just how heavily policed the state was. Moreover, subjecting the citizenry to sustained propaganda and misinformation via state-controlled media. Everyone pretty much knew it was misinformation. The longer it went on, the more the government thought they could just get away with it. And so they didn't bother really giving a good quality propaganda and say all the citizens knew it was rubbish they were being fed. And this in turn created a certain sort of attitude of don't care, which feeds back into the economy, of course. Citizens required government permission to change jobs or move to a new area. There was no freedom of association as we understand it in the West at least. They needed permission to visit a relative in the next town or to travel abroad. Similarly, special permission is required to emigrate. In capitalism, choice and freedom of association plays a central role in most transactions. Citizens are more likely to support a transaction and a situation involves free transactions when they're freely entered into it. Now, the absence of market signals is also an important aspect. Centrally planned economies cannot generate market signals of price, quality and adequacy of supply. There is no market competition, so products don't improve and there aren't new systems developed to improve. What signals are generated cannot be acted upon in a reasonable time frame. This was not necessarily a problem while scarcity of labour and resources existed in those first 2 5-year plans and then the rebuilding after World War II. But it quickly became so as labour became more abundant and industrialisation and levels of supply had moved into approximate equilibrium by the early 1970s. At this point, only much smaller increments of productivity increase could be achieved, while 3 million more young people were leaving school and college to enter the workforce each year. That's a lot of workers to absorb. For ideological and central planning reasons, the Soviet economy just could not fashion itself around the economic elasticity demands of a purposefully inefficient, full employment but low productivity economy. To ensure full employment, a central socialist tenet, jobs were invented or created or young men were drafted for longer terms in say, the armed services. Inefficient factories were kept open, and inefficient only because they could absorb more otherwise unneeded workers. By the late 1980s, the crushing weight of so much inefficiency, invented jobs and outdated plans and equipment was seriously taking its toll. Another point is over-planning. From its inception, the Soviet planning system became an expression of revolutionary ardour and zeal. As a result, planners were chasing optimistic plans to the point of gross unreality. They never lost that, the chasing of these unreal plans. The lack of margin for error was palpable. These plans were very tightly packed and like a rubber band sort of pulled to the absolute maximum tightness. Heavy coercion frequently had to make up what were nothing more than plans dreamed up by ideological hacks and rather brutish amateurs. In capitalism, where a full profit loss is at stake, planning tends to have more elements of practical reality, and failure tends to be corrected much earlier in the cycle and tolerated generally for a shorter time. Next thing is the profit motive, which of course wasn't evident in communism or socialism. In communism, the gain or loss of any exercise is fully socialised or collectivised across the entire economy or the entire population. And this has the effect, obviously, of minimising any personal incentive to avoid poor quality products or to avoid waste. In capitalism, the efforts to avoid loss means wastage, in a relative to the Soviet economies anyway, is minimised far more often than not. We've talked a bit about organisational rigidity and the possibility of corrective action within a rigid organisational plan. Soviet planning assumes only those with communist revolutionary fervour can be permitted to make or evaluate planning decisions. So there's these very ideological commissars at the top of all the planning, all that decision making, rather than practical experts in the area. Everyone else is there to implement plans and a little more. Accordingly, corrective action cannot be taken in any optimal time frame, even then only by those at the planning ministries. Other than large public service bureaucracies, most Western private businesses allow managers on the spot to take corrective action, or at least escalate it to a manager who can take that corrective action. The all citizens work and all consume. Again, this is mentioned before, this is very efficient. You know, everybody's working, everybody's consuming. And this is a socialist sort of theory in itself, given that if everyone's working, everyone's consuming, all the entire economy is spread over the whole population. This is efficient, but from a theoretical and mathematical point of view only. But if the state is simply creating jobs, or factories, or anything that have no actual or even intended productive utility, then you've got 2 or 3 people doing the job that one worker could easily do. Thus, at the level of production, inefficiency turns out to be at its maximum. While Western governments create do-nothing jobs in, say, public service bureaucracies, private business in the competitive sectors of the economy cannot do such a thing and survive. Lack of worker incentives. Citizens can boost their pay with overtime or productivity bonuses, but with the near complete absence of a consumer goods retail sector and a wait-in-line system of very short, very limited supply of consumer goods, workers have no material incentive to better themselves. Why work hard to make more money when there's nothing you can really buy? Capitalist economies are the complete opposite here, and on this specific point where consumption of consumer goods makes a large part of the economy. Now, cronyism is the last point here. Ideology, not work, is the way to a better life. If you wanted to get ahead, only party goons and party favourites would have access to the best food shops and the retail stores and the Western movies and the Western goods and the parties and the best vodka and the best caviar, the best holidays and all that sort of thing. So if you wanted to get ahead or really find those benefits or access those benefits, really the only career you could have would be a Communist Party hack. So aspiring to be a party hack is thus the only path to a better life. You've been with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening, and we hope you found this essay informative. Our essays are available in printed book format. Just select your 14 favourite essays from our list and orders can be placed at the email address below.